Hi guys, so this is the video lecture on writing a narrative speech, and while our book does a really good job of going into communication concepts and talking about speech in a high level way, I don't feel like it always does a good job of giving you a step-by-step of how to write certain kinds of speeches. And I'm also going to apologize if I'm having trouble finding words today. My brain is really fuzzy for some reason, but I really needed to get these up for you. So I'm sorry about that. We'll just roll with it. So what do we do when we write a narrative speech? Well, narrative speeches tell a story, and typically the story will be a meaningful story. It'll demonstrate a lesson or show an event that helped define you as a person, maybe illustrate an important example for the audience. The speech should focus both on the message and telling the story, and typically the message is highlighted in the introduction and the conclusion, and the body kind of is where you tell most of the story and relate it to that message. So when you're choosing a topic, most of the time the topic is going to be something from your life. It'll be a defining moment or a time when you overcame a challenge or even a funny anecdote that illustrates an important lesson. Research is generally not required for these speeches because you're speaking from personal experience, and the focus is on you and what you learned. Reversing the prompt, a good trick for both essays and speeches is to turn the prompt around to come up with ideas. So if the prompt is, what is the most important moment in your life? To reverse it, you're just going to take the most important moment in your life part and put a blank after it. So the most important moment in my life was blank. And then make a list of moments you could use to fill in that blank to help you come up with topics. You'll then narrow that list of topics to choose something that's interesting to you, would likely be interesting to the audience, and is appropriate for the situation or for the prompt. You'll know what the best ones for you are. It's not something where I can kind of tell you what a good topic is or what a good topic isn't. Just you would want to think about something where you learned an important lesson that might be interesting to someone else or illustrate something important that's relatable to the audience. Maybe like a lesson that you learned or a mistake that you made that you want to help them prevent, or how to work through a situation that you want to help them work through. So for pre-writing, after you've narrowed down your list of topics, you're going to want to answer some questions about each of the potential topics. And if you only have one, then you only have to do this one time. So what message or lesson does this story illustrate? Why is or was this story important? Why might other people find it interesting? This is something you can use for the audience relevance statement. What was the climax or defining moment in the story? This is kind of going to help you figure out where you want to end in your body. And then you can kind of work backwards from there. What led up to the climax or defining moment? Context is really important, and if you're showing a change, the best way to show that change is to show what you were like before so that the audience really understands what you're like after too. So then what happened in the climax or defining moment, and what happened after? Why was it important? How did it change you? Can I remember any specific details like sights, smells, or tastes from that defining moment or the time before? This is really good for helping you to create your introduction or to make that last bit of the body a little bit more powerful. And you'll want to set the list aside now that you've made it. We'll use it in the next steps. And you'll be making a very similar list of this when you do your pre-writing for this in about a week. So now you want to create your goal or your purpose statement. So questions for this step. What message or lessons does this story illustrate? Why is or was this story important? The goal or purpose statement concisely outlines the goal of your speech. So a good way to do that is to start with, my goal is, and then follow it up with a strong verb that describes the lesson, purpose, or goal, and add a short description of the story after. For example, my goal is to show the audience blank through blank. Then you can use that to create your thesis statement. So there are a couple approaches here. One is to add an audience relevance statement to the goal statement, or you can add main sections of the speech to your goal statement. It's going to depend on what you want to do, which of these organizational approaches you want to use. So for example, for the audience relevant, by talking about my experience with blank, I hope to show you why blank is important. Or to like, for instance, if you wanted to show how you overcame bullying, you might talk about the steps that you took. So to overcome bullying, I did blank, blank, and blank. Those are two ways you can create a thesis statement for this type of speech really easily. You can use these sample sentences and fill in the blanks with your own information for your own experience. So questions for developing the body. What was the climax or defining moment in the story? What led up to that? What happened? What happened after? And can I remember any specific details like sights, sounds, or smells? These, if you remember, are questions we created in the list earlier. The body of the speech is where you'll tell the story itself, and everything should relate back to your thesis statement. A good way to do this is to have your transition sentences connect back to your thesis statement so that you're alluding to it throughout the speech. As with essays, you want to separate your body into paragraphs. Start each paragraph with a topic sentence that outlines the main idea of that paragraph, and end each one with a transitions sentence that explains why the details in that paragraph are important, and ideally how they relate back to the thesis. Some common structural approaches for narrative essays, which apply to speeches as well, are on the next couple of slides. So one sample structure is called the journey. You start with in your introduction, you start with your attention getter, and start in the middle of the most important moment of the story, and then tell why that moment was important, and then end on your thesis statement. Your second paragraph will talk about any background information, any context, kind of the before of the story. Then the third paragraph, you'll talk about main lessons that you learned. From there, you can talk about applications of those lessons to how you use the lessons in life afterward, and then you explain how you might use those lessons in the future. You will want to add, this is more for essays, so you will want to add an audience relevance statement right in here. This is a good one where you use a thesis as the audience relevance statement, and it's a good idea to add a sentence or so at the end to connect to the audience. You know, now that I've learned this lesson, my life is better because I'm hoping you can gain this insight or learn this from this speech. A second one is to focus on themes. So in the first paragraph, you tell a very short version of the story, and then the thesis would focus on the three main lessons learned from the story. So this is when you're going to use that second type of thesis. In your first body paragraph, you'll explore the first lesson you talk about in your thesis, and you can show what you were like before, explain the problem, explain how you worked through the problem, then explain the lesson and how you've applied it to other areas of your life. You'll repeat the same thing for paragraphs 3 and 4, and then in the last paragraph, recap the thesis and main point, explain how you'll use the lessons in the future. You also, in the introduction, you want to add in an audience relevance statement. In the conclusion, it's a good idea to tell the reader what you hope they learned from it and how it'll benefit them. In the introduction, this is kind of going more into detail about introductions in general, but it applies to both types we just looked at. So in this step, you want to look at the questions: what message or lesson does the story illustrate? Why was it important? And why might other people find this interesting? These are things you used in creating your goal statement, but the why might other people find it interesting is how you find your audience relevance statement. And strong introductions will include 3 elements. They'll include the attention getter, audience relevance statement, and a thesis statement or goal statement. Some good attention getters for narrative speeches are rhetorical questions like, have you ever? Descriptive details, the immersing the audience in that moment, or such as, I remember that it smelled like cherries on the most important day of my life. That kind of thing really draws a reader in and helps them, or an audience in, and helps them to kind of be in that moment with you. For audience relevant statements, you want to explain why your audience should be interested in what you're saying and relate the story to the audience's life in some way. You can do this by telling the audience what they can learn, or suggest that they can avoid making the same mistake if the story focuses on a mistake, or here's how you can work through this kind of problem. Just something to tell them why this is important to them, why they should continue listening. Don't start at the beginning of the story in your introduction. I can't say this enough. The introduction is about providing context and showing the audience why they should listen to your speech. You'll actually start the story in the first body paragraph. You've heard me say this like 4 times now. If you start at the introduction at the beginning of the story and then just continue through the story, they don't understand why you're telling them this story. It's just a story. So you definitely want to take that time in the beginning and the end to provide context for your speech. In conclusions, We've talked about this a little bit before, but conclusions typically don't add any new information. I know they feel repetitive, but that's kind of the point. They're just kind of sum up and tie a bow on the box. The majority of it is just paraphrasing what you've already said. So you want to start by paraphrasing your thesis statement. You don't want to say it word for word, because then that kind of gets obvious and the audience will think you're lazy. But then summarize your main points. Again, paraphrasing them so that it doesn't sound like you're just repeating yourself. And the only new part of the conclusion is the clincher. And you can ask rhetorical questions there, include strong details or a call to action. Rhetorical questions might be, so now that you've heard my story, how will you use this to improve your own life? Strong details would just be something that would be very memorable that they might remember. A call to action would be, now go do this. And then after that, you want to edit what you've written to make sure all the main components are there. Look for places to add signposts and traditional or transitional elements to improve flow. Because remember, when you're reading a speech or you're performing a speech, you don't have those paragraph breaks that are visual for the reader to see like you do in an essay. So the audience has to have something to kind of help them figure out how to get from point A to point B. You do want to rehearse it at least a couple of times so that it doesn't look like you're reading off of the screen. So that, you know, and it'll sound more natural, it'll sound more conversational. We'll talk about that later with conversational tone and why that's important, but you do want to do that. And definitely take a second to test your tech before you start recording. I've seen a lot of speeches where students are struggling with the tech in the middle of the speech, and it's okay when I do that because I have to do a lot of these speeches for my classes, but you really only have to do it once. So just take like a minute, make sure all your tech is doing what it's supposed to be doing so that you don't have to go back and do it multiple times or it doesn't distract from the speech. And that's the end of this lecture on creating and performing a narrative speech. I look forward to hearing your stories, and I hope you guys have a great day.